Hello and welcome back to Duskferry. Somewhere behind you, the day is finally over. Whatever it held, the noise of it, the rushing, the small unfinished things still sitting in the back of your mind, none of that needs to come with you tonight. For the next little while, none of it is your job anymore. If you can, dim the lights now. Put on your headphones if that's how you like to listen. Get all the way comfortable, the kind of comfortable where you're not planning to move again. You don't need to remember anything you're about to hear. You don't need to stay awake for the end. If you drift off somewhere in the next 10 minutes, that isn't you failing to listen. That's exactly what this is for. Tonight, we're crossing back to 1718, to a ship that ran aground on purpose, a captain almost nobody can agree on the real name of, and a wreck that nobody found again for 278 years. This is Duskferry. Let the voice carry you the rest of the way from here. We're crossing now. A name written in smoke. 278 years is a long time for anything to lie on the bottom of the sea. Long enough for wood to soften and iron to rust into shapes that no longer look like the objects they once were. Long enough for a ship to stop being a ship in any way you'd recognize, and become instead a low mound on the seafloor, a mile off the coast of North Carolina, in water so shallow that on a calm day, sunlight still reaches all the way down to it, moving in slow gold ripples across metal nobody has touched with a human hand in centuries. For most of those 278 years, nobody knew it was there at all. Ships passed over it. Fishermen anchored near it without ever knowing what their lines were drifting past. The inlet around it filled and shifted and refilled with new sand, the way coastal inlets always do, until the very shape of the coastline that had swallowed the wreck no longer matched any map from the year it went down. We'll come back to that mound of iron and timber, and to the November morning in 1996 when a small research boat finally found it, more than a lifetime after anyone alive had any reason to go looking. But to understand why anyone would spend years of careful, patient work searching a stretch of ocean for the wreck of a single ship, you first have to understand the man the ship was named for. A man whose real, documented life turns out to be quieter, stranger, and considerably more uncertain than the legend that grew up around him. You have probably heard his name before. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let yourself picture him the way most people do. The black beard, thick and long, the lit fuses smoking faintly under the brim of his hat, the black flag with its skeleton and its raised spear, snapping in the wind above a deck full of armed men. Most of that picture, as it happens, is genuinely accurate, which is rarer than you might think for a pirate story that's survived 3 centuries of retelling. But before we get to the beard and the smoke, we have to start with something almost nobody agrees on, something historians are still quietly arguing about today. We don't actually know his real name. The records that survive from the men who feared him, fought him, and eventually killed him call him Thasha or Thatch. Spellings that turn up again and again in contemporary letters, ship manifests, and court documents, written by people who had no reason to get his name wrong, because they'd stood close enough to be afraid of him. The name Teach, the one that made its way into the history books and eventually into every film and cartoon version of him since, comes mostly from a single Boston newspaper report, later cemented permanently into popular memory by a sensational book published just 6 years after his death, called A General History of the Pirates. That book did more than almost anything else to shape how the world would remember him. Dramatic, vivid, occasionally more interested in a good story than a verified fact, and read by nearly everyone for the next 200 years as though it were a court transcript rather than what it actually was. An early, wildly successful work of popular true crime writing. We'll call him Blackbeard here, the way people at the time most often did, by nickname, by reputation, by the thing he'd built himself into. Because in most cases, there was no birth certificate anyone thought to keep, and the nickname is, if anything, more honestly documented than his given name ever was. His birthplace is usually given as Bristol, England, sometime around the year 1680. It's worth being honest with you gently about exactly how we arrived at that. Nobody has ever found the record. It's a reasonable estimate, built backward from his approximate age at death, somewhere between 35 and 40, rather than any surviving document that actually names a place and a date. Everything about his life before the year 1717 follows this same pattern. Plausible, commonly repeated in 100 books and documentaries since, and almost entirely unproven. Some later writers imagined a comfortable, literate upbringing for him, reasoning that a man who could read and write fluently, which Blackbeard clearly could, unusual for an ordinary sailor of his era, must have come from at least some money and some schooling. It's a fair guess. It remains honestly only a guess, one storyteller's reasonable inference passed down so many times it eventually started to sound like established fact. Even the popular idea that he spent years as a privateer, a government-licensed raider, legally sanctioned to attack enemy shipping during wartime, in the years before he turned pirate doesn't hold up especially well against the actual paper trail. No surviving document places a man clearly identifiable as Blackbeard aboard any specific privateering vessel during that conflict. The plain, somewhat startling truth, as far as historians can tell you, with any real confidence, is this. The man the whole world would eventually call Blackbeard doesn't reliably exist in any surviving record at all until the summer of 1717, which means that everything about his life before that summer, his childhood, his family, his years at sea before anyone thought his name worth writing down, is still, in the most literal sense, a locked door that nobody has ever found the key to open. What we do know, with far more confidence, is exactly where his story picks up once that door finally does open. In the company of another pirate, an older, more established one, in a lawless little harbor town in the Bahamas, sometime in that same year, a place that had, by then, become something the 18th century had never quite seen before. His name was Benjamin Hornigold, and for a while before the whole Atlantic coast learned to fear him on sight, the man history would remember as Blackbeard was simply somebody else's understudy. Let yourself settle in. This is a long story, and it deserves to be told slowly, the way the truth so often turns out to be once you actually go looking for it instead of settling for the version everyone already believes. The Apprentice, by 1717, the town of Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, had become something close to a pirate republic, a phrase historians use only half as a figure of speech. There was no functioning royal governor, no court that pirates had any reason to fear. What there was, instead, was a natural, well-sheltered harbor, a growing population of men who had decided that raiding merchant shipping was a considerably more promising career than anything else available to a sailor of modest birth in the early 18th century, and a rough, self-organizing set of rules that some later writers would nickname the Flying Gang, a loose alliance of the port's most successful captains, more a fraternity of shared interest than any formal government, but functional enough to keep the town running on something like its own terms for several years. Benjamin Hornigold was already, by this point, one of the most successful captains operating out of that harbor, experienced, respected among his peers, and building, ship by captured ship, something closer to a small private flotilla than a single vessel working alone. It's worth understanding how pirate crews of this era actually organized themselves, because it explains a great deal about how quickly a newcomer could rise. Successful captains, once they'd captured more prizes than they could crew or use themselves, would hand command of a captured vessel to a promising subordinate. Not out of generosity exactly, but because a larger combined force, working in loose coordination, could take bigger, better defended ships than any one vessel could manage alone. By around September of 1717, a man the records call Thash, we'll start using Blackbeard from here, since this is roughly the point where the nickname begins to take hold in the surviving paperwork, was entrusted with exactly that kind of opportunity. His own captured sloop, his own small command, under Hornigold's overall authority. Whoever he had been before that year, he was evidently promising. The two men and their combined crews spent the final months of 1717 working the shipping lanes together, first through the Caribbean and then up along the American coast, taking a run of prizes and building precisely the kind of reputation, resources, and confidence that would let Blackbeard step fully out from under his mentor's shadow within only a few more months. Their most consequential joint action, the one that would change the entire shape of Blackbeard's career and give him the ship that would make his name, came in late November of that year, off the island of Martinique, when their combined force overtook a French vessel unlike anything either man had captured before. We'll spend the whole of the next part on that ship alone, because what happened aboard her deserves far more care than a passing mention. For now, it's enough to know that shortly after that capture, the partnership between the two pirates came to a quiet, apparently entirely amicable end. Hornigold stayed largely within the Caribbean and Bahamian waters he already knew best. Blackbeard, newly equipped with something far more powerful than anything he had commanded before, turned north, toward the American colonies, and toward the story that would eventually make him the most feared name on that entire coastline. It's worth pausing here before we follow him north, for a detail the popular legend tends to leave out entirely, because it quietly complicates the simple picture most people carry of pirates as men who simply never stopped. Benjamin Hornigold, the man who trained the most notorious pirate in American history, did eventually stop, and sooner than you might expect. Less than a year after parting ways with his former protege, Hornigold's own crew grew frustrated with him. He held, by most accounts, a personal rule against attacking British shipping specifically, a rule that was cutting sharply into the crew's potential earnings, since a great deal of profitable shipping along these routes happened to be flying a British flag. It was an ordinary hazard of pirate leadership in an era when a captain generally held his position only for as long as his crew consented to it, through something close to a rough democratic vote. Hornigold's crew voted him out. Put ashore or otherwise sidelined, Hornigold made his way to the Bahamas' newly appointed royal governor, a man named Woodes Rogers, and accepted the king's official pardon then being offered to any pirate willing to give up the trade for good. He didn't retire quietly, though. Hornigold spent his final months working as a privateer for the very crown he'd spent years raiding against, hunting down his own former associates on England's behalf. A strange, almost uncomfortable final chapter for a man who had once run one of the most successful pirate operations in the Atlantic. He never crossed paths with Blackbeard again. His story ends not in a sea battle and not at the end of a rope, the two endings pirates of this era most commonly met. It ends in a hurricane, his ship wrecked on a reef somewhere between New Providence and Spanish territory, and Benjamin Hornigold, the man who had first given Blackbeard a ship of his own to command, was lost to the very same ocean he had spent his entire career sailing. Blackbeard, meanwhile, was only just getting started, and the ship that would make his name, the one whose rusted iron skeleton is, right now, tonight, still sitting quietly on the floor of the Atlantic, had only just fallen into his hands. A slave ship becomes a warship. On the 28th of November, 1717, off the coast of Martinique, Hornigold and Blackbeard's combined force closed in on a French vessel called La Concorde. It should be said plainly, because the real history deserves to be told honestly rather than romantically, the way it so often gets told in the more excitable retellings. La Concorde was a slave ship. She had left France months earlier carrying 516 enslaved Africans in her hold, bound across the Atlantic for the brutal, deliberately dehumanizing economy of the French Caribbean sugar plantations. One voyage among the many thousands that made up what historians now call the triangular trade, the vast, sustained machinery of Atlantic slavery that moved goods, people, and profit between three continents for the better part of 4 centuries. By the time the pirates found her, disease had already done what would, in almost any other story, have been described as the worst part of this chapter on its own. 17 of the enslaved captives had already died during the crossing, and 36 of her 75 French crew were themselves incapacitated by scurvy and dysentery, the two diseases that stalked every long ocean crossing of this era with grim, predictable regularity. La Concorde was already, in the plainest possible sense, a ship in crisis, long before a single pirate ever fired a shot at her. The capture itself was almost bloodless, not because Blackbeard showed any particular mercy, but because there was barely a fight left in her to have. 2 volleys from the pirate sloops were enough to convince Captain Pierre Dosset commanding a crew that was now more than half unable to even stand at their posts to surrender without further resistance. What happened next is worth sitting with rather than rushing past, the way so many retellings of this story unfortunately do. The pirates took La Concorde to the small island of Bequia, in what's now called the Grenadines, and put both the French crew and the enslaved Africans ashore there together. From this point, the historical record becomes genuinely uncertain, and honesty requires saying so directly rather than filling the gap with whichever version makes for the better story. Some retellings claim that a number of the enslaved captives were offered a choice, freedom of a kind, in exchange for joining the pirate crew. This is possible, and it isn't unreasonable to imagine. Pirate crews of this era were, by the standards of their time, unusually integrated, and later records do show black sailors serving among Blackbeard's men in the months that followed. But it isn't well documented for this specific moment at Bequia, and careful historians treat it as plausible rather than proven. What is better supported by the surviving record is a harder, plainer truth. The great majority of the more than 450 enslaved people taken from La Concorde were not freed at all. They were left in the custody of the French crew, who ferried them onward, in two separate trips, aboard a smaller replacement vessel the French sailors themselves named, with what reads today as an almost unbearable irony, mauvaise rencontre, meaning bad encounter, to the port of Martinique, where they were sold into slavery exactly as originally intended, the pirates' arrival having changed only who profited from the voyage, not its outcome for the people trapped inside its hold. It is not a detail this story can simply skip past on its way to the more thrilling parts. It is, in its own quiet way, as much a part of what Queen Anne's revenge actually was as any cannon later mounted on her deck. Separately, a small number of the French crew, a cabin boy and 3 others, by most accounts, chose to join Blackbeard's company voluntarily, drawn by whatever mixture of desperation and opportunity a captured sailor weighs in a moment like that one. Roughly 10 more were simply conscripted outright, given no real choice in the matter at all, which was itself an ordinary, unremarked-upon practice of the era. Once the ship's remaining cargo and trade goods had been sold off at Martinique, Blackbeard took La Concorde for himself. He stripped her down to her hull and rebuilt her, over the following weeks, as a dedicated warship, upgrading her armament from roughly 14 guns to somewhere near 40, an extraordinary amount of firepower for what had begun life as a merchant slaver, and gave her a new name that would outlive every single man who ever sailed aboard her. He called her Queen Anne's Revenge. At her peak strength, one contemporary newspaper account describes her carrying as many as 300 men, an almost unheard-of crew size for a pirate vessel of this era, closer in scale to a small naval warship than to the single-sloop operations most pirates ran, with a fraction of that number. The ship had 40 guns and 300 men, the account reads, a plain sentence that, at the time, would have been enough on its own to make any merchant captain along the coast think twice before risking a fight. She was roughly 200 tons, about 100 feet from bow to stern, and from this point forward, for exactly 7 months, she would be the single most feared silhouette on the eastern seaboard of colonial America. It's a strange, uncomfortable thing worth sitting with quietly for a moment, before we move forward into the raids that made her captain famous. The ship that gave Blackbeard his legend began her working life as an instrument of the slave trade, and ended it as an instrument of piracy. 2 different kinds of theft, sailing under 2 different flags, carried on the exact same hull by many of the very same timbers. We'll come back to this thread once more, much later in this story, in a small, unglamorous detail that divers would eventually pull from her wreck nearly 3 centuries later. A detail that quietly, almost silently, connects everything Queen Anne's Revenge ever was, from her very first voyage to her very last. The man built out of smoke. Before we follow Queen Anne's Revenge into the raids that made her captain famous along the entire American coastline, it's worth understanding exactly what kind of fame Blackbeard was actually building for himself, because it turns out to be a considerably stranger, more deliberate kind of fame than the modern picture of a simply bloodthirsty pirate captain usually suggests. The physical description that survives him, recorded by people who genuinely saw him in person, and, by their own accounts, never quite forgot the sight, is fairly consistent from source to source. A tall man, well over 6 feet, at a time and in a population where that height alone was rare enough to be immediately remarkable. A long, thick black beard, worn by most descriptions, braided in places and occasionally tied off with small ribbons or bits of cord, framing a face that people who met him described as naturally intimidating even before he did anything at all to enhance it further. And he did enhance it, deliberately and with real theatrical care. The detail you have almost certainly heard before: slow-burning fuses, the kind gunners of the era used to ignite cannon, tucked in under the brim of his hat and lit just before a confrontation, is genuinely real, or at least as real as anything from a period this thinly documented can be reasonably confirmed to be. It appears independently in period accounts written by people with no obvious reason to invent it, not merely in the more embellished retellings written after his death for a public hungry for exactly this kind of vivid, unsettling image. Burning at a slow, controlled, carefully managed rate, the fuses would wreath his head and shoulders in drifting smoke throughout a fight, giving him, in the low, uncertain light of a ship's open deck, something very close to a genuinely demonic silhouette rising up out of gun smoke and confusion. He never actually set his own hair or beard alight, whatever the more excitable modern cartoons and retellings occasionally imply for the sake of a better visual. He never needed to go that far. The effect, by every surviving account, worked exactly as intended, exactly as far as he'd calculated it needed to. And here's the detail that tends to surprise people most, once they actually look past the legend and into the documented history underneath it. For a man whose very name became a lasting byword for pirate violence, Blackbeard is not reliably recorded in any surviving primary source as having killed a single person before the final battle of his own life. Not one confirmed victim, across 7 full months of raiding up and down the wealthiest shipping lanes of colonial America, commanding one of the most heavily armed pirate vessels ever to sail those particular waters. This wasn't restraint born of any particular softness of character. It was strategy, a genuinely effective one, and one that a great deal of pirate activity across this whole era quietly depended on. A ship's captain and crew, weighing whether to fight or simply surrender the moment a vessel bristling with 40 cannon and flying a black flag pulled up alongside them, generally did the arithmetic the way most frightened, badly outgunned people facing an impossible fight tend to do. They surrendered. And pirates of this era, Blackbeard very much included, understood something that made this whole system self-reinforcing: a reputation for letting a surrendered crew go largely unharmed, stripped of valuables, humiliated perhaps, but alive, made every single future surrender that much easier to obtain. Fear, carefully cultivated and consistently rewarded with mercy, turned out to be considerably cheaper and considerably more efficient than actual violence ever could have been. Every ship that gave up without so much as raising a weapon, purely on the strength of what its crew had already heard about the man commanding the vessel bearing down on them, was itself proof that the fuses smoking under his hat brim were doing precisely the job he had built them, patiently and deliberately, to do. It's a strange thing to say about a pirate, and stranger still once you've spent this much time with the documented facts of his life, rather than the legend built on top of them. But it may be the single truest thing that can honestly be said about this particular man. The most dangerous weapon Blackbeard ever carried was never a cutlass, and never even his 40 cannon. It was his own carefully constructed reputation, and he spent the coming months investing in it with as much deliberate care as any other captain of the era might invest in gunpowder, rigging, or a well-drilled crew. The most spectacular demonstration of that investment was still ahead of him, and it wouldn't take place out at sea at all, in the kind of ship-to-ship encounter this whole story has described so far, but in the harbor of one of the largest, wealthiest, and most heavily defended port cities anywhere in colonial America. A ransom of medicine. By May of 1718, Blackbeard commanded a small flotilla entirely his own, Queen Anne's Revenge, together with 3 smaller vessels, roughly 300 men between them. And he brought that flotilla to anchor directly across the entrance to the harbor of Charlestown in the colony of South Carolina. the city we know today as Charleston. For nearly a full week, nothing moved in or out of one of the busiest, most economically vital ports in all of British North America without Blackbeard's explicit permission. Picture it, if you can, from the perspective of the city itself. Merchants watching their ships sit idle at anchor, unable to safely leave harbor. Families of sailors already at sea, with no way to know whether their ships would make it home past the waiting pirate flotilla at all. A whole city's commerce, its entire economic lifeblood for that week, simply frozen, held hostage by 4 ships and 300 men who had done nothing more than position themselves in exactly the right place and let their reputation do the rest of the work. His ships intercepted at least 9 separate vessels attempting to enter or leave the harbor during those days, seizing cargo and taking hostages from among their passengers and crew, including notably a sitting member of the colony's own governing council, a man named Samuel Wragg, whose sudden, very public captivity would have made the danger feel immediate and real to every powerful family in the city. What Blackbeard demanded in exchange for finally releasing the port is the detail that tends to surprise people most about this entire episode, and it's worth letting it land the way it must have landed on the governor who received the demand. Not gold, not jewels, not a chest of coin, none of the things a pirate ransom is supposed to be about in the popular imagination built by 2 centuries of adventure fiction. He wanted medicine, specifically a full chest of medical supplies, at a time when several conditions, common among sailors, syphilis very much among them, had no true cure available but could at least be managed, painfully and imperfectly, with the medications of the day. It's a detail that says something quietly, unexpectedly human about the practical realities of running a crew of several hundred men across many months at sea, board ships with no trained doctor, and no easy, no questions asked access to a port that would treat them without turning them over to the nearest magistrate. Governor Robert Johnson, facing a besieged harbor, a captive councilman, and no realistic way to fight off 4 armed vessels without risking exactly the kind of bloodshed nobody in the city actually wanted, complied. The chest of medicine was delivered out to the waiting ships. Blackbeard, true to the pattern he had already carefully established and would maintain almost without exception throughout his career, released his hostages the moment the terms were met, stripped by most surviving accounts of their finer clothing and any valuables they'd been carrying, but otherwise left entirely unharmed, exactly as his reputation had already promised anyone who simply cooperated with him. No confirmed deaths came out of an entire week spent holding one of colonial America's major ports hostage. A remarkable, and by now remarkably familiar, continuation of the pattern from the last part of this story. Terror managed with real precision and consistency, doing all the work that violence, in Blackbeard's particular case, almost never actually had to do. It was, by any reasonable measure, the absolute height of his power. A single pirate captain, commanding a flotilla smaller than many national navies of the era would have deployed for a single squadron exercise, had brought a major American city's entire commerce to a complete standstill for a full week, purely on the accumulated strength of his name and his guns, and walked away with precisely what he had asked for, without firing a single shot in anger. Barely a month later, he would make a decision that historians still debate the full meaning of to this day, one that would cost most of his own crew everything they had sailed with him to earn. The wreck that wasn't an accident. In early June of 1718, only a few weeks after his triumph at Charleston, Blackbeard sailed his flotilla south along the Carolina coast and attempted to bring Queen Anne's Revenge into what was then called Topsail Inlet, the shallow, sand-choked entrance to what's now the town of Beaufort, North Carolina. She ran aground. On paper, taken entirely at face value, it reads like an ordinary maritime accident. A large, deep-drafted ship, unfamiliar with a shifting, treacherous inlet, catching a sandbar the way vessels of this era did, with genuine regularity along the notoriously dangerous Carolina coastline. A stretch of water sailors already called, even then, a graveyard for ships. The sloop Adventure, sailing in company alongside her, ran aground herself shortly afterward, in what may have been a rescue attempt gone equally wrong. Here is where the story becomes genuinely, honestly uncertain, in a way worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. No confession survives. Blackbeard never explained himself, not to us, not to any court, not to anyone at all in the surviving historical record. But the consensus among most historians who have studied this particular event closely, a consensus, it should be said plainly, rather than an absolutely proven certainty, is that the grounding wasn't an accident at all. Blackbeard was, by every surviving account of his seamanship, an experienced and highly capable navigator, someone who had already proven himself more than capable of threading exactly these kinds of shallow coastal waters. Running his own flagship aground in familiar territory, at precisely the moment it would prove most convenient for him, strikes most historians who've examined the case closely as simply too well timed to be pure misfortune. Even Stedebonnet, a fellow pirate captain who had briefly sailed in company with Blackbeard around this period and later complained bitterly about how he'd been treated, seemed to share the same suspicion at the time. The theory, and it remains a theory, however well supported, rather than a documented fact, goes like this. Blackbeard had accumulated, by this point in his campaign, an enormous quantity of plunder, vastly more than could ever be evenly divided among a crew of 300 men, without leaving every single one of them a genuinely wealthy man. He was also, around this same period, beginning to think seriously about securing a royal pardon for himself, a considerably easier proposition to negotiate with a small, manageable, trusted company of men than with an army of several hundred armed and increasingly restless pirates trailing behind him wherever he went. Losing 2 ships at the mouth of a shallow inlet solved both problems for him at once, in one carefully engineered stroke. It thinned his company drastically, by design rather than by chance, and let him walk away quietly with the overwhelming bulk of the accumulated treasure divided among a much smaller circle of men he actually trusted. Whatever the true, unrecorded state of his intentions that morning, the outcome that followed is well documented. Blackbeard marooned a substantial portion of his remaining crew. Estimates range from roughly 15 to 25 men, depending on the source, including Adventure's own captain, a man named David Harriet, on a small, uninhabited sandy island near the wreck site, left there with no meaningful provisions to speak of, while he sailed on with a company reduced to a fraction of what he'd commanded only weeks earlier at Charleston. One period account describes 40 white men and 60 black sailors departing with him at this particular point. Still a substantial crew by most standards, but a small one indeed compared to the 300 who had held an entire city hostage barely a month before. By the time of his final battle, 5 months later, the company remaining aboard his last vessel had shrunk again, down to somewhere near 19 men in total. It was, if the prevailing theory holds true, an act of calculated betrayal against his own crew, disguised with real skill as simple bad luck and a treacherous inlet. And it set Blackbeard up, deliberately or not, for the next chapter of his life. Not as a wanted pirate commanding something close to a private navy, but as something almost unimaginable given everything that had come before it. A pardoned man, a private citizen, at least for a little while. A quiet life that wasn't quite quiet. In the wake of the Beaufort Inlet grounding, Blackbeard sailed north along the coast to the small town of Bath, North Carolina, the colony's political and social center at the time, small and unremarkable as it genuinely was compared to a city like Charleston. And there, sometime in the middle of 1718, he formally accepted the King's Act of Grace, a royal pardon offered broadly to any pirate willing to abandon the trade for good, granted to him personally by the colony's governor, a man named Charles Eden. This part of the story is documented plainly enough. Eden did pardon him in a formal, recorded act of colonial authority. What surrounds that pardon is considerably murkier, and it's worth presenting to you exactly as murky as the surviving record actually is, rather than dressing it up as settled fact in either direction. There were persistent accusations, circulating even at the time among Blackbeard's contemporaries, that Governor Eden and North Carolina's own customs official, a man named Tobias Knight, had personally accepted his share of Blackbeard's considerable plunder in exchange for the pardon itself, and more importantly, for continuing to look the other way as he went on operating comfortably in the colony's waters afterward. Knight was formally investigated over these specific allegations, and the accusations were taken seriously enough at the time to prompt real official scrutiny, but no surviving court record proves a specific corrupt arrangement beyond reasonable doubt. And it's worth noting plainly, in fairness, that the person pushing hardest to make these particular accusations stick, Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, whom we'll meet properly in the next part of the story, had his own considerable political motive for wanting North Carolina's governor thoroughly discredited in the eyes of the Crown. Treat this honestly as a documented and seriously investigated accusation, rather than a conclusively proven fact. The other detail from this period that tends to get repeated as settled history in book after book and documentary after documentary is a marriage. A young local woman, often named in popular retellings as Mary Ormond, reportedly wed to Blackbeard in a small ceremony that Governor Eden himself is sometimes said to have personally officiated. It's a genuinely good story. It also rests on remarkably thin evidence, essentially a single family letter, written generations later, recounting oral family tradition passed down through the years, with no surviving marriage record, no will, no independent contemporary witness confirming her specific name at all. What is somewhat better supported by the actual record is this. Officers actively pursuing Blackbeard around this time did report that he had, in fact, married someone in North Carolina, and a separate colonial official, writing from an entirely different posting in the Leeward Islands, mentioned hearing rumors of yet another wife and children waiting for him back in London. Taken together, the honest, careful picture that emerges is that Blackbeard likely did marry, or at the very least present himself publicly as a married man, sometime during this settled period. But the specific, oft-repeated name and story, so often attached to her, should be understood gently as folklore layered generously on top of a genuine but very poorly documented underlying fact. Whatever the deeper truth of his domestic life during these months, this settled period at Bath was brief. Roughly 2 months by most careful reconstructions of the timeline, stretching from the middle of 1718 into August of that same year. By late summer, Blackbeard was back at sea and back to raiding, in direct and open violation of the very pardon he had only just accepted from Governor Eden's own hand. That single decision to return quite deliberately to the exact trade he had just been formally forgiven for is the one that finally brought the full weight of colonial authority down upon him in earnest. Not from North Carolina, where he had already made his uneasy, possibly purchased peace. From next door, in Virginia, from a governor who had never trusted him and never forgiven him in the first place. A governor with no jurisdiction? Alexander Spotswood, the royal governor of Virginia, had a problem, and it's worth understanding exactly what kind of problem it genuinely was, because it explains a real and rather strange legal wrinkle sitting right at the heart of this story's final chapter. Blackbeard, by late 1718, was operating almost entirely within North Carolina's own waters, a separate colony with its own governor, its own courts, and, as far as the law of the time was technically concerned, absolutely none of Spotswood's business to interfere with. Spotswood sent an armed expedition after him anyway. His reasons, as best historians today can carefully reconstruct them from surviving letters and official correspondence, were a genuine tangle of motives rather than any single, clean, easily stated justification. There was real, entirely legitimate concern that a pirate operating so close to Virginia's own shipping lanes and river trade posed a direct and serious commercial threat, regardless of which precise colonial boundary line he happened to be sailing on the technically wrong side of. There was also deep and, in fairness, largely well-earned, distrust that North Carolina's own governor either couldn't or, more troublingly, simply wouldn't actually police the problem sitting comfortably in his own colony's waters. And there was, quite plainly and understandably, an element of personal ambition sitting underneath both of those more principal concerns. A royal governor who could successfully claim credit for finally ridding the American coast of its single most notorious pirate stood to gain considerably in reputation, both back home in London and among his own colonial peers. Acting so far outside his own colony's legal borders to accomplish it was genuinely controversial, even among his own contemporaries at the time. A real and acknowledged legal overreach, however carefully it was dressed up afterward as simple, urgent necessity. Spotswood funded the entire expedition personally, out of his own private resources rather than through any official colonial military channel that might have required someone else's approval first, and gave overall command to a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard. Maynard was given two hired sloops for the mission, named the Jane and the Ranger, small, shallow draft vessels, chosen quite deliberately because they, unlike a larger and more heavily armed naval warship, could actually navigate the treacherous, constantly shifting shoals of the Outer Banks that had already claimed so many ships before them. It was a calculated trade-off, made with real care, maneuverability, chosen deliberately over raw firepower. Neither of Maynard's two sloops carried any cannon at all. The expedition departed from Hampton, Virginia, on the 19th of November, 1718, and by the 21st, only 2 days later, Maynard had already located his target. Blackbeard's one remaining vessel, the sloop Adventure, sitting calmly at anchor in the shallow, island-studded waters of Ocracoke Inlet along the North Carolina coast. Blackbeard, by every surviving account, had already been warned that an attack might well be coming his way. He chose to stay at anchor regardless, with a crew that had, by this point in his story, shrunk to somewhere around 19 men in total. Whether that decision reflected genuine confidence in his own men and his own reputation, simple physical exhaustion after 7 relentless months at sea, or something closer to plain fatalism, no surviving record can tell us for certain, and perhaps Blackbeard himself could not have entirely explained it either. What happened the following morning is, by a wide margin, the single best documented day of his entire, largely undocumented life. The morning of the 22nd. Try for a moment to picture the scene the way it must actually have looked at first light. 2 small, unarmed-looking sloops, low in the water, easing carefully through a maze of shoals and sandbars toward a single-anchored pirate vessel in the pale, still quiet of a November morning along the North Carolina coast. No cannon fire yet, no shouting, just the sound of water under 2 hulls and the slow, deliberate approach of men who had sailed 2 full days specifically to reach this one particular stretch of shallow water. Maynard's 2 sloops closed on Adventure at first light on the 22nd of November, 1718, threading their way through the very same tangle of shallow water and shifting sandbars that made Ocracoke Inlet both an excellent hiding place for a pirate crew, and fortunately for Maynard, genuinely navigable ground for his own shallow draft vessels in a way it simply wasn't for anything larger. Blackbeard's crew, forewarned days earlier and fully ready, didn't wait passively to be boarded. As the 2 sloops drew near, Adventure's guns fired a single devastating broadside directly into Maynard's lead vessel, the Jane, one well-aimed, perfectly timed volley that killed or badly wounded a significant portion of the men aboard her in a single stroke, cutting Maynard's effective fighting force down dramatically before the 2 crews had even come close enough to properly exchange small arms fire. It was, by any honest measure, a brutal, highly disciplined, and immediately effective opening move. Exactly the kind of decisive first strike you might expect from a crew who had spent the better part of a year learning, engagement by engagement, exactly how to win a fight before it had properly even begun. For one brief, suspended moment, it must have looked from Blackbeard's own deck, very much like the entire fight was already won before it had truly started. Maynard, left with a badly reduced crew in a visibly damaged vessel drifting in open water, made a single decision that would end up deciding the entire battle to come. Rather than continuing to close the distance in the open, where Adventure's remaining guns could simply reload and fire on him a second time, likely finishing what the first broadside had started, he ordered the bulk of his surviving, unwounded men down below decks, entirely out of sight, leaving only a small, deliberately visible skeleton crew still working openly on deck. To anyone watching from across the narrowing gap of water, it would have looked exactly like a ship that had already been beaten, her deck all but emptied of anyone left willing or able to fight. It worked exactly as Maynard had hoped it would, believing the sloop weakly crewed, all but undefended, and entirely ripe for an easy final boarding. Blackbeard led a portion of his own remaining men directly across the narrowing water onto what looked, from where he stood, like a nearly empty deck waiting quietly for him. It wasn't. What the record actually says. The moment Blackbeard's boarding party set foot on the Jane's deck, Maynard's hidden men rose up from below all at once, and the two crews were suddenly fighting hand-to-hand, at close, brutal quarters, in exactly the chaotic, desperate way naval boarding actions of this era generally unfolded. Cutlasses swinging in the small space of an open deck, pistols fired at point-blank range with no time to reload a second shot, men grappling and slipping on planking, gone slick with blood and seawater, with no clean lines anywhere and nowhere left for anyone to retreat to. Maynard and Blackbeard, by most careful reconstructions of the fight pieced together from surviving accounts, ended up facing one another directly, close enough to see each other's faces in the chaos. What's actually documented about Blackbeard's death in accounts written close enough to the event itself to be treated with genuine confidence, including reports that draw directly on Maynard's own account of the engagement, given not long after the fact, describes him being shot approximately 5 times and cut or stabbed roughly 20 times before he finally went down for good. Some later retellings round this figure up to an even more dramatic-sounding 25 wounds, a number that isn't unreasonable given the underlying primary figures, though it's worth knowing plainly that the rounder, tidier number is a later simplification rather than an independently documented count all its own. It is, by any honest standard, a genuinely brutal death. A man who had spent 7 entire months building a reputation specifically designed to make actual violence unnecessary, finally forced, in the last minutes of his life, into precisely the one kind of close, desperate confrontation his fuses and his beard and his carefully cultivated name had always been built to make entirely avoidable. He did not go down easily, by any surviving account. Whatever else about his life remains genuinely uncertain. The sheer ferocity of his final few minutes is about as well documented as anything in this entire story gets to be. After his death, Blackbeard was beheaded, the act itself credited in most surviving accounts to a Scottish Highlander serving among Maynard's crew, and his severed head was suspended from the bowsprit of Maynard's vessel for the return journey north, later displayed openly on a pole near the mouth of the Hampton River in Virginia, as a deliberate public deterrent to any pirate crew that might happen to sail past and draw the obvious, intended conclusion for themselves. Here is where this story asks you, gently, to notice the real difference between what actually happened that morning and what people started saying happened, almost as soon as the fighting itself was over. You may have heard somewhere along the way that Blackbeard's headless body, once he'd finally fallen for good, rose back up on its own and swam several full, deliberate circles around the ship before it finally sank beneath the water for the last time. A detail so strange, so vivid, and so unforgettable that it's become one of the single most repeated images in his entire legend. It does not appear in Maynard's own written report. It does not appear anywhere in the contemporary newspaper accounts published in the weeks immediately following the battle. It does not even appear in Captain Johnson's General History of the Pirates, published only 6 years later, at a time when the story was still fresh enough that any sufficiently dramatic detail worth including would almost certainly have made its way into those pages. It is, as far as the actual documented record can show us, a piece of folklore that grew up sometime well after the fact, a story people told and kept telling, because a headless body simply falling still, the way bodies actually, quietly, unglamorously do, apparently didn't feel like a big enough ending for a man like Blackbeard had become in the public imagination. The real ending, as it happens, needed no embellishing at all. It simply took a little longer to fully arrive, and it came bundled together with a second legend, every bit as vivid as the first, and just as far removed from anything the documented record can actually support. The cup that was never found. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Maynard sailed north for Virginia with Blackbeard's severed head mounted at his bowsprit, and roughly 15 or 16 surviving members of the pirate crew held in custody below decks, bound for trial. That trial, when it finally came in March of 1719 before Virginia's Vice Admiralty Court in Williamsburg, a court that, under the admiralty law of the era, operated entirely without a jury of any kind, went about as badly for the defendants as you might reasonably expect it to. Most of the men tried, commonly given in the record as 13 in total, were convicted and hanged along a stretch of road just outside Williamsburg, a road that afterward became known, with a kind of grim, unadorned directness typical of the period, as Gallows Road. Their bodies were reportedly left displayed there afterward for some time, put to the exact same grim, deliberate public use that Blackbeard's own severed head had already been serving further down the coast. 2 men out of the whole group were spared entirely. Samuel Odell, who had been aboard the ship for only a single day before the battle and was acquitted outright once the court understood how briefly he'd actually been involved, and Israel Hands, Blackbeard's own former quartermaster, who received a formal pardon of his own. Maynard, meanwhile, returned home to Hampton, Virginia, to what should, by any reasonable expectation, have been the crowning moment of his entire naval career. The man who had personally killed Blackbeard, arriving with the head itself as undeniable proof. He did receive a version of that welcome. What he did not receive, by most careful accounts of what followed, was anything close to the full financial reward he might reasonably have expected for the achievement. Because he had distributed some of the captured plunder directly to his own crew without first waiting for proper official authorization to do so, the formal prize money that eventually followed went, in large part, to the men who had originally organized and financed the expedition, rather than to Maynard personally. His naval career did continue afterward, but only modestly, not at all the triumphant, rapid advancement you might reasonably imagine for the man who had just ended the most feared pirate career on the entire American coast. And Blackbeard's head, the one unambiguous, physical, thoroughly documented remnant of the man himself to survive the battle at all, simply passes quietly out of the reliable historical record after its public display near the Hampton River. Whatever ultimately happened to it after that point is, honestly and plainly, unknown, which is exactly the gap that a second legend, arriving more than a century later, rushed eagerly in to fill. In the 1830s, an antiquarian writer named John Fanning Watson wrote that Blackbeard's skull had, at some unspecified point, been fashioned into the base of a large silver punch bowl, said to be kept and regularly used at the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, a single written claim, appearing well over 100 years after the events it describes, with no earlier source of any kind standing behind it. The story didn't stop there either. In the 20th century, a North Carolina folklorist and sitting state legislator named Charles Wedby elaborated on it considerably further, claiming outright in a book published in 1989 that he had personally seen and had even personally drunk from a silver-plated skull bearing the inscribed words, "Death to Spotswood," during a secret ceremony held on Ocracoke Island sometime in the early 1930s. It is, by any honest reading of the surviving evidence, a genuinely wonderful piece of folklore. It is also, as far as any historian who has actually gone looking for a Tucker family, an Alexander Ross, or any specific Masonic lodge meaningfully connected to this particular story, has ever been able to determine, entirely unsupported by anything even resembling a real documentary trail. No such object has ever been independently located, physically examined, or authenticated by anyone at all outside the original claims themselves. The story on close inspection bears more than a passing resemblance to older, entirely unrelated skull-cup legends already attached to secret societies in general, across several different countries and centuries, which is exactly the kind of detail that tends to make careful historians suspect a good, portable story, borrowed wholesale from somewhere else entirely, and then quietly reattached to a more famous, more marketable name, rather than a genuine local tradition with its own independent roots reaching back to the actual events. So here is where this particular part of Blackbeard's story actually, honestly ends, as plainly as the surviving record allows it to. A severed head displayed publicly in Virginia in the early months of 1719, and then, quite simply, nothing further. No cup, no lodge, no secret ceremony that anyone besides a single storyteller, writing 2 full centuries later, ever personally claimed to have witnessed. Just an old, deeply understandable human impulse to give a genuinely remarkable story, an even more dramatic final chapter than the plain documented truth actually offered on its own. The truth, as it turned out, still had one more chapter left in it after all. It simply took 278 years to finally arrive. 278 years. For nearly 3 centuries after Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground at the entrance to Topsail Inlet back in June of 1718, she simply disappeared from human knowledge entirely, not lost in any single dramatic, sudden moment, but the way most things eventually are lost across that much accumulated time. The inlet itself shifted, the way sandy coastal inlets along this stretch of coast always eventually do. Silt and storm after storm, slowly, patiently rearranging the seafloor above her, until nobody left alive could say with any real confidence at all exactly where a grounded ship from the age of pirates might actually still be resting, 300 years on. The search that eventually found her began in careful earnest during the 1990s, led by a private research and salvage company called Intersal Inc. The company's president, a man named Phil Masters, spent years quietly working through historical records, contemporary period accounts, and old surviving charts, gradually narrowing down the single most probable location of the wreck based on detailed period descriptions of exactly where and precisely how Blackbeard's flagship had originally gone aground. It was patient, careful, entirely unglamorous archival work. The kind of painstaking research that looks nothing whatsoever like the dramatic treasure hunting montage you might naturally picture in your head, and looks instead like years spent in library reading rooms, poring over old shipping records and faded manuscripts, long before anyone involved ever got anywhere near open water with a boat and a dive team. On the 21st of November 1996, nearly 278 years, almost to the very week after the ship had first run aground, Intersal's operations director, a diver named Mike Daniel, finally located a wreck site roughly 1 mile off the coast near Beaufort Inlet, resting in only about 28 feet of water, close enough to shore and shallow enough that on a clear day, sunlight still reaches all the way down to the wreckage sitting quietly below. It's worth being genuinely precise with you about exactly how certain that initial identification actually was, and about how that certainty grew carefully and incrementally over the following years. Because the honest answer here is considerably more interesting than a simple flat, yes, they found it. It's really a quiet story about how careful archaeology actually works out in the real world, far from the movies. For roughly the first 15 years following the discovery, the project's own archaeologists consistently described the case for the wreck's identity as strong, but still fundamentally circumstantial. A formal project report from around 2001 used a careful, deliberately measured phrase that's worth repeating exactly, that the threshold of doubt is met, a clear, confident statement, but notably not a claim of absolute mathematical proof, since no single artifact, like a bell or a plate engraved plainly with the ship's actual name, had yet turned up to settle the entire question beyond any possible argument at all. What the site did have, accumulating patiently year after careful year of painstaking underwater excavation, was an overwhelming weight of consistent, mutually reinforcing evidence. An armament profile precisely matching a large, heavily gunned vessel of exactly the right era and exactly the right general size. A bronze ship's bell, dated to the early 1700s, recovered navigational instruments consistent with the period, and gradually thousands upon thousands of individual artifacts, all consistent with a French-built early 18th century vessel that had, at some identifiable point in her working life, been substantially converted for war. In 2011, the state of North Carolina formally confirmed the identification based on that entire accumulated body of evidence, considered carefully all together as a whole, rather than resting on any single piece of proof. It's the honest, careful kind of confirmation worth respecting for exactly what it is. A conclusion built on genuine consensus and steadily converging archaeological evidence, rather than one single, unambiguous, name-engraved object settling the matter in an instant. State archaeologists today treat the identification as settled fact. It's fair and accurate to describe it to you as the overwhelming, officially accepted consensus, arrived at exactly the way real archaeology actually reaches its most durable conclusions. Patiently, cumulatively, one carefully recovered and carefully cataloged artifact at a time, across years and years of unglamorous, painstaking underwater work that almost nobody outside the project itself ever saw happening in real time. And that same work, remarkably, is still going on right now, tonight, as you listen to this. What the sea gave back. As of the most recently published figures, more than 300,000 individual artifacts have now been recovered from the wreck site, believed, with overwhelming confidence, to be Queen Anne's Revenge, with roughly 60% of the entire mapped site now carefully excavated. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extensively documented pirate-era shipwrecks ever studied anywhere in the world. A slow, deliberate, endlessly patient unraveling of exactly the kind of solid physical evidence that no single legend, however dramatic or vivid, could ever have honestly provided on its own. More than 30 cannons have been carefully raised from the seafloor, one at a time, each requiring its own painstaking recovery. Two large anchors, a bronze ship's bell, dated to the early 1700s, close enough to the historical timeline to sit comfortably and consistently alongside everything else the site has produced over the years. Navigational instruments that once, 3 centuries ago, helped some long-forgotten crew member find his own way along exactly this same stretch of coastline you might be picturing right now. Gold dust, along with small glass trade beads of a kind historically used, deliberately and cynically, as currency within the slave trade itself. A small, quiet, entirely physical echo of the ship's very first life, the one we told you about many parts ago now, back before she was ever renamed, back when she carried a very different kind of cargo, under a very different flag entirely. And, among the many thousands of recovered artifacts, a substantial cache of genuine medical and surgical equipment, a syringe manufactured in Paris in the early 1700s, of precisely the kind used at the time to treat the very condition that a certain chest of urgently ransom medicine, demanded from a besieged harbor at Charleston, was very likely intended to help with. Pump clysters, a small bowl, possibly once used in the era's common practice of bloodletting. A mortar and pestle, brass fittings that some researchers now believe may have once formed part of a makeshift surgical tourniquet, improvised from whatever materials happened to be available aboard. Small, unglamorous, entirely human objects, each one recovered piece by careful piece from the very same wreck that had once carried 40 cannon and 300 armed men along this coast. All of it, every single cannon, every trade bead, every carefully labeled fragment of glass or iron or bone, passes eventually through a dedicated conservation lab in Greenville, North Carolina, where the slow work of stabilizing 3 full centuries of accumulated saltwater damage happens on a timescale most of us rarely have to think about at all. A single large cannon alone can take 5 to 10 full years just to properly desalinate, sitting patiently in carefully managed chemical baths. One quiet season at a time, long, long after the divers who originally found it have already moved on to other parts of the wider site. Even now, current lab work has expanded well beyond the original wreck itself to related maritime archaeology projects across the state, recovered dugout canoes from other historic sites, careful work aboard other preserved vessels, while the North Carolina Maritime Museum, the wreck's primary public home and exhibit space, has been temporarily closed for renovation, its most treasured artifacts recalled quietly to the lab for careful condition checks and fresh imaging during the closure. It is a strange, fitting kind of ending for a story that began with a man almost nobody today can even confirm the real name of. Blackbeard spent his entire, brief, 7-month career deliberately building a legend so large and so vivid that people are still inventing entirely new pieces of it more than 200 years after his actual death. A headless swim around a ship that the record shows never actually happened. A silver skull cup that has never once been found. A wife whose commonly repeated name may not even be the correct one at all. And underneath every single piece of that accumulated legend, the whole time, entirely unconcerned with any of it. The real ship simply sat quietly on the bottom of the sea, waiting with more patience than any legend could ever manage, for someone to finally come looking for her properly. They found her, in the end, not with a treasure map and not with a single word of legend to guide them. With years of careful, unglamorous reading in old archives, and a diver who knew exactly where and exactly how carefully to look. If you're still here with us, wherever you're listening from tonight, however far into the dark your own room has already gone, let that be the very last thought this story leaves with you. Not the beard, not the smoke, not even the wounds. Just a ship, resting quietly exactly where she has rested for nearly 3 centuries now, patient enough to wait for someone to come and find her properly, exactly the way it actually, honestly happened. Rather than the way the legend, so many times retold, always wanted it to be instead. The tide is still moving over her tonight, the same slow way it has moved every single night since 1718. It doesn't need you awake to keep doing that. You don't either. Sleep now. If you're still here with me, if you made it all the way to this last quiet minute, thank you for staying. That's Duskferry for tonight. New crossings arrive every week. If you'd like to come back for the next one, the subscribe button is right there. Whenever you're ready, no need to decide anything now. Wherever you are, whatever the room around you sounds like, the tide is still moving somewhere tonight, the same slow way it always has. It doesn't need you awake to keep doing that, neither do I. Good night.